accurate, but it also has to be balanced. It has to represent in a fair way a range of views. And that seems to me to be the key violation here.
The BBC has what's called a royal charter as well as editorial guidelines. And that's a social contract between the BBC and the British public. The British public are fee paying, they pay for their TV licence fee, which helps to fund the BBC. So that's essentially a contract between the BBC and the British public.
Now, let me quote from the BBC's editorial guidelines in the Charter. Impartiality lies at the heart of public service and is the core of the BBC's commitment to its audiences. Now, there's a case for saying that because of its reporting, its biased reporting, the BBC is in gross breach of that Charter commitment.
And people in the public are reduced to literally banging on the doors of the BBC. Thousands of people outside having demonstrations because they simply no longer feel represented. They don't feel represented by the organisation that they are paying for. The right to decide what is balanced and not balanced, what is fair and what is not fair, what can go in and what can't go in, has been handed to something called the BBC Trust. The BBC Trust are appointees to dictate the editorial policy, etc., of the BBC. And the BBC operates under a royal charter. A royal charter means that at the peak of that pyramid, officially, that controls the BBC, is the Queen. Now, the royal charter is controlled by the Queen, controls the BBC, and then under her is something called the Privy Council, privy meaning private. These are appointees, former politicians and lords and, people from the system. And through them and the government ministers of the day, and officially through the Queen, all these people are appointed to the BBC Trust, which dictates BBC editorial policy and says what's fair and what's not fair. And obviously, well, you've only got to watch the BBC for a while. One of the conclusions they've come to is the Israeli version of everything can be given because that's fair, and the Palestinian version of the same thing cannot be given because that's unfair. How they call it? Balance.
The most comprehensive study of BBC and actually ITV coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict was carried out by Glasgow University's Media Research Group, which has a worldwide reputation as a centre of excellence for what it does. And in 2003-04, it carried out a long study. It analysed 200 hours of programmes. It interviewed at least 800 people, many of them journalists, reporters, editors, producers. And its conclusion was that the BBC's coverage of the conflict was biased in Israel's favour.
What we do when we study the media and content of media, and we've looked at a whole range of different areas, but essentially what we do is look at the range of explanations that are available on any given subject in public debate. So we would look at all the different positions, all the different perspectives, the different arguments, and the evidence that's available for each of those arguments. And then we simply compare that map of what is possible with what actually then goes out.
After the Glasgow University report was published, the report was called Bad News from Israel. Its group leader, Professor Greg Philo, said that they were approached by many journalists, especially from the BBC, saying, look, there are many reasons why we are under pressure to limit our criticism of Israel. And Greg said that they said to him, we'd like you to make this public because we can't.
The journalists were in some ways quite sympathetic to the Palestinians in the sense that they would be sympathetic in a human sense to anyone who was suffering. So they would feature images of of funerals, or of widows who are crying, or children who are suffering, or that material would be on the television. And that would be, as far as the journalists were concerned, the Palestinian case. That would be the Palestinian side of the argument. And then on the other side, you would have all of the explanations about why this was happening, which were coming essentially from Israel and from the Israeli perspective.
This former national security advisor is even saying Israel could reoccupy the entire Gaza Strip as a last resort.
At the end of the day, we might be a situation in which we don't have any other alternative if Hamas will not stop launch rockets and missiles into Israel.
I think I would say, from my knowledge of the IDF and from the extent to which I've been following the current operation, I don't think that there has ever been a time in the history of warfare when any army has made more efforts to reduce civilian casualties and deaths of innocent people than the IDF is doing today in Gaza.
We tried to de-escalate. Messages were sent. We told Hamas to stop this rocket fire, but they continued. And now we are acting. The Israeli Defense Forces are acting to bring about a situation where the people of Israel no longer have to live in fear.
Back in the rubble, Salim's mother is calling on Hamas to avenge her son, who was about to graduate from college. Israel isn't ruling out a much broader offensive if Hamas attacks don't stop. The choice ahead now for Israel is withdraw or hit much harder. Orla Gearan, BBC News, on the Israel-Gaza border.
Well, undoubtedly, there are in the BBC some very senior people who are for Israel, right or wrong. And because it's biased in its coverage of reporting the Israel-Palestine conflict, people end up being misinformed or totally confused.
How can you talk about peace if you do not examine the causes of war? And that seems to me to be absolutely central. And that if the causes of a conflict are explained almost entirely from one side, then how can you even begin to discuss how to resolve a conflict? And the conflict in Israel and Palestine is so festering, it has so many impacts on the rest of the world and on conflicts elsewhere, that it's absolutely crucial that they move to some sort of solution in it. And I think the way in which it's being explained, the way in which it's discussed, the complete absence of any attempt to really get to the historical causes and reasons for it, other than to very largely repeat the Israeli account, that absence is I think very damaging to the public interest in this country, and I think it's a violation of what the BBC is supposed to do.
There were two groups, at least that I'm aware of Gazan Palestinians that brought cases within the within the UK courts, the United Kingdom courts, against the BBC for what they believed to be their biased coverage, because they were minimizing the casualties that were taking place in Gaza, even in some cases removing journalists who reported on civilian casualties.
So if you translate that then into public understanding, we then go out and ask people, and we say, well, did you see the pictures? They say, oh yes, it was terrible. I saw dreadful, dreadful pictures. Palestinian children dead. Oh, it was so sad. It was awful. People would say to me, I can remember a woman saying to me, I cried when I saw the pictures of the Palestinian children. But then the next thing she said was, but it didn't make me sympathize with the Palestinians, because the Palestinians don't want peace. Yeah? And what she then did was to repeat the Israeli perspective. And we found this very commonly in the focus groups, that people would say, oh yes, it's awful for the Palestinians, it's terrible, but if only they would just accept peace, if only they would stop starting the trouble, if only they would stop stirring up the trouble. Because the perspective on why it was happening, on the history of it, on the reasons for it, all of that was dominated by the Israeli propaganda machines.
One of the most egregious examples of BBC bias was during the 2008-2009 Israeli bombardment of Gaza. Despite massive suffering, the BBC refused to broadcast the Disasters Emergency Committee charity appeal for the beleaguered people of Gaza. Keep in mind that Gaza's borders were completely closed, and thus the Palestinians had no place of refuge. Even worse, over 800,000 of Gaza's inhabitants at the time were children.
Today, this is not about the rights and wrongs of the conflict. These people simply need your help. Several hundred have been killed in Gaza in recent weeks. A large number of them have been children. Some of those who have survived are traumatized from the loss of loved ones. UK aid agencies report that 60% of the population is now living in poverty. Thousands are malnourished, with more than 1 million dependent on aid to survive.
People will die because of the BBC decision. Let me be clear about that. And I started my life 60 years ago as a BBC producer. I love the BBC. I support it. But it is capitulated to Israeli pressure. That's the truth. I have to tell you. I'm going to do it myself. Anyone who wants to contribute, I'm going to do that. And I'm sorry, you're not going to stop me. You're not going to stop me. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. The Disaster Emergency Committee Gaza Crisis is available at P.O. Box 999, London, EC3A 3AA. And I know from the BBC, because I've been here most of the morning, nobody here agrees with what the BBC have done. 1,330 people have been killed, 460 children, 5,480 casualties, and the reason the BBC have done it is very simple. The Israeli government objected.
When journalism becomes little more than propaganda for the state, we might want to consider the dangers this poses not only to the people of Gaza, but to ourselves. For instance, what if the BBC is purposely withholding information that protects the terrorists responsible for 9/11?
The evidence for a controlled demolition is overwhelming. You have 2.25 seconds of free fall, which means 100 foot of that building disappeared. 8 stories disappeared and it fell through thin air. The BBC has treated that like the plague.
The argument is very simple and rational. If World Trade Center 7 was brought down by a controlled demolition, and if the BBC is withholding critically important information that essentially covers up this fact, then the BBC is literally protecting whoever is responsible for the destruction of WTC 7. Now that's not bad journalism. That is material support for terrorism. And in the next episode of In Focus, we shall reveal why this damning judgment is the only sensible and intelligent conclusion one can reach.